Britain's terror threat is at its highest level since 9/11, with extremists in the UK using the war in Gaza as a springboard to recruit new members.
Now, according to some of the UK's top security officials, MPs have been advised that intercepted terrorist chatter, I don't know what that means, is at its highest level since the early 2000s.
Well, let's discuss this now with the former NATO commander, Rear Admiral Dr Chris Parry. Welcome, Chris. This can be quite scary language that we're using here. Do we have a reason to be as concerned?
I think we need to be vigilant at the moment. I think the real problem that we have is we've got a substantial proportion of our community that is importing grievances and conflicts from abroad. And they're playing them out in our democracy. They're using the freedoms the law allows. And I'm afraid to say that our security services are working very hard right now to make sure this doesn't translate either into lone wolf or systemic attacks against our infrastructure, our people, or things like that. In fact, I spoke to somebody recently who said to me, you know, we've got to get used to the fact that our front door is becoming our front line.
Chris, really interesting. Last hour we were discussing this, and because of my brain, I can't remember who we speak. Chip Chapman.
Yeah.
And he was saying that we have to understand the difference between terrorism, I mean, people planting bombs, and hate crime. That doesn't mean that hate crime is any... I'm not even going to argue
not that
what's
it's not
worse.
important.
It's absolutely important. Is it important that we find that line? I mean, for me, I've said my piece repeatedly on this show. I think the police need to be more proactive. I don't know whether I'm confident of a Prime Minister standing in Downing Street telling the police what to do, but they seem to be stood there a lot of the times. They don't understand that. There's lots going on terror-wise. What about hate crime? What do you think's going to happen in this country? Because things like Galloway and Galloway's assistant there, Chris Williamson, saying Israel's forfeited the right to exist. That's more than hate crime. That stirs up real trouble, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that's probably illegal too, to actually say a country that is...
Well, he's being investigated by the police.
Yeah, a country that is actually sort of recognised by the United Nations, that has a legitimate existence in the world. To say it doesn't exist is ridiculous. And I think all of us would deplore that. The fact of life is we have to have a balance between free speech, say what we like, and what actually leads to violence. And I think what we need to do is analyse much more precisely what leads to violence.
What do you think it is? What is the difference between peacefully protesting and... Nick was near last week. I was saying that a lot of these protests are peaceful, but they are being hijacked by fanatics, and they are. Whatever anybody says, they are increasing in whatever sphere. Just stop it, whatever. It's happening, right? How are we going to deal with that as a society?
Jeremy, in every sphere of our society and our institutions right now, we've got activists. You have an agenda. Some of it is ideological, some is, as I say, importing conflicts and grievances from abroad. What we have to do is say, look, if you're going to have a protest, anybody who disagrees with those people protesting should feel safe in its vicinity. If you don't, then it's not peaceful.
The whole thing breaks down.
That's the sort of thing. But what we also have to do is be much more precise about what we mean by threats to our society and terror. The vast majority of our Islamic population is hardworking and very loyal to Britain. But I'm afraid it is a sea in which a large number of extremist ideas and potential extremist actions take place.
And it's really important, isn't it, to make that distinction between people who are peacefully protesting. You know, you can't have hundreds of thousands of people on the street and all of them being bad actors.
No.
Obviously, people are there because they're seeing these horrendous images on their phones of, you know, children, hospitals, etc., being targeted. They have a right to protest. And yet there's so much inflammatory language being used by our leaders. We've got, you know, the former Home Secretary saying what she said. We've got the current Home Secretary saying, you know, to protesters, well, you've made your point, as if the protest should therefore finish. But surely that in itself is just going to push people underground to find, you know, perhaps be further radicalised.
Do you know what I want to know is the people who are peacefully protesting, who have a right in our democracy, I'd love to see what they think or what they would do to the fanatics and the extremists who are hijacking that and giving the whole thing a bad view. What do those people think?
They would disagree with them themselves and feel, you know,
So they don't want them hijacking their stuff. So why can't the police be heavier-handed with those fanatics?
Because they're trying to contain it. At the end of the day, yeah.
What does that say about policing, Chris?
Well, I think it's a question of the greater evil, isn't it? Do you want bloodshed on the streets? No, you don't. So it's better to contain it, probably. That's probably how the police are thinking. But here's the issue. What are we trying to achieve here in terms of outcomes? All I hear is ceasefire, as if that is the solution to the problem. It isn't. My question to people who are always saying ceasefire, ceasefire is, how do you get justice for the victims of 7th of October? How do you get rid of Hamas? How do you make the region peaceful for anybody that needs and wants to live there? When you give me a solution for that on a protest, I'll come and join you.
What did you make of Kamala Harris, overnight, saying we need a ceasefire, pause for 3 seconds, for 6 weeks? Kamala Harris.
Well, she's not a military expert, is she? And the Israelis aren't going to take any notice of that. And I don't think she's going to be the vice presidential candidate much longer.
So what is the answer?
The answer is, I'm afraid, the people who have most at stake here are the Israelis. They are the only ones that have a plan. And their plan is to eliminate Hamas from Gaza. And I suspect they'll want to achieve that before Ramadan on the 10th of March, when it gets fairly sticky, to tell you the truth. It always does.
Why is that?
Well, because traditionally Ramadan is when you see all sorts of things associated with Intifada and all these other reactions in not just Gaza, but in the West Bank as well. So it could actually get more complex. So I suspect Israel wants to deal with Hamas.
Whilst the rest of the world, and I'm not talking about social commentators, there's the Vice President of the United States. I always thought Israel was relied upon America and listened to America.
They're extremely strong allies, and yet they're supposed to be strong allies, and yet America is dropping aid from aeroplanes. They obviously don't have a particularly strong relationship at the moment, or certainly don't have as much influence on the Israeli government, on Netanyahu, and yet they disagree with the way in which he's carrying out his campaign against Palestine.
Depends who you listen to.
Okay.
I'm not sure who's running US foreign policy right now. It certainly isn't the president who should be running it. And I think we're in the dog days of
Should he? He got Gaza and Ukraine confused twice.
Yeah, but he isn't running it. I think you'll find that his cabinet is running foreign policy. If you've seen the film El Cid, at the end of it, they put El Cid, who's dead, on his horse to go and fight the battle. Right. I'm afraid that's what we're looking at in America right now.
I just think it's really important. Obviously, we mentioned Ramadan earlier within the context of the conflict in the Middle East. But of course, Ramadan is a religious holiday and festival that takes place in the UK and is a very peaceful part of the religion of Islam.
Just like Christmas.
Exactly. But it can be weaponised by extremists, which unfortunately is what we're seeing all over the world.
We just need to remain vigilant, Nikki, that's all.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you to former NATO Commander, Rear Admiral Dr Chris Parry.